Hello folks. I've looked at quite a few inexpensive stick welders, and recently I reviewed the ESAB Rogue ES180i. The Rogue is 2 to 3 times the price of the cheap Amico stick welders I've reviewed. You do get a lot for that extra money though, and I feel it's worth the extra cost if you can afford it. Today I'll be looking at the Fronius Transpocket 180 MV. MV stands for multi-voltage because this welder can run on 120 or 240 volts. This welder is about twice the price of the ESAB, and it has a somewhat similar feature set and output. Because of the similarity and the fact that I just reviewed the ESAB, I will be noting how they compare from time to time. Hopefully you'll get an idea of any advantages this welder may offer and whether or not it adds up to enough value for you to justify the price. Bear with me because this welder has a lot to cover and I like to be thorough. The Transpocket 180 comes with a large, heavy-duty rolling case with side handles and a shoulder strap. Personally, I probably wouldn't get much use out of it. It's kinda huge. It is really solid and it should have room for cables and a few accessories. It's a nice case if you have a use for it. The included cables are a big step up from anything I've seen included with a welder. The cables are 13 feet long, which is longer than other cables I've seen, but they are also a much thicker gauge than any cables I've seen included with any welder. Thicker cables means less voltage drop, which means less wasted output and more power for your weld. This does mean they're a bit heavier, but they are excellent cables. The work clamp has a very stiff spring, a copper strap, and this is the first welder that I've reviewed that when I talked about the work clamp, I didn't have to say something about how good or bad the clamp was for a stamped steel clamp. It is simply a great quality clamp, and it is not stamped steel. The electrode holder is also very nice. It has precise fitting jaws that open smooth and straight, and it has a stiff spring. It feels good and it feels solid. The power cord on this machine is detachable, and it actually comes with 3 different cords. There's cords with kind of your typical 15 and 20 amp plugs, and it comes with a twist lock 3-prong plug. It also comes with kind of a typical adapter to use with 50 amp 240 volt receptacles. It's kind of nitpicky, but since they're including 3 different plugs anyways, I kind of wish there was a separate cord for this plug rather than an adapter. The power cords are all 8 feet long, and they are all 12 gauge SO cord, which is very nice. The connector on the welder end of the cord is proprietary, but it's compact, it looks like it's very good quality, and it does securely lock in place. Like the ESAB Rogue, this welder is rated to handle a wide range of input voltage, supposedly allowing use with up to a 300-foot extension cord. So you should be able to get really far away from an outlet if you need to. Overall, this is hands down the best quality stuff I've had included with any welder. Taking a look at the welder itself, the build quality is very good. It doesn't really feel any better than the ESAB Rogue, but the Rogue feels extremely well built, so it's not exactly a negative for the Fronius. However, there are little touches on the Fronius that show an attention to detail that is a step above. It comes with a signed test and calibration certificate. That form shows the various tests done and measurements taken to confirm proper output and proper calibration of the display and the settings. Not that big of a deal, but it does show an attention to detail and quality control. The removable power cord with the locking connector is a nice touch, particularly for portability. My favorite little detail is this grill on the back for the cooling fan air intake. The grill is actually removable, revealing a cleanable dust filter. Pretty cool. It also includes a very simple, well laid out little guide for all of the settings. It turns out that this welder has quite a few settings, so this little cheat sheet card is pretty nice. Speaking of settings, the start current can be adjusted as a percentage of the welding current, and you can go above and below 100%. This allows a hot start when set over 100% or a soft start if you set it below 100. You can also adjust how long the welder will stay at the start current before switching to the weld current. Arc force is also adjustable. There is an anti-stick feature that can be turned on and off. When on, this feature will detect a stuck rod and turn off the welding current so that you can break the rod free without arcing, and it prevents burning up the end of the rod while it's stuck. You can also adjust the voltage at which the arc will break when snapping out of a weld. When you get to the end of a weld and snap out, either when TIG or stick welding, the voltage will rise as the arc lengthens. Eventually, the arc will get long enough that it cannot be maintained and the arc will break. With this welder, you can actually set how high the voltage has to get before the welder will turn the arc off. This setting can be turned up to allow a longer arc or turned down to give cleaner stops when snapping out. This could be particularly helpful when snapping out in TIG mode. Rather than having to violently snap out like with some lift arc machines, you can set this one so it only requires a moderate lengthening of the arc for the arc to turn off. This can help prevent a loss of shielding at the end of a weld. You can also set what amperage breaker or fuse you're connected to on your supply circuit. Setting this lower limits the maximum output to prevent tripping a breaker. This feature can also be turned off, simply allowing full output all the time. This welder also has pulse in both TIG and stick modes, and it's adjustable from 0.5 to 100 Hertz. There are 3 main modes on this welder: a standard stick mode, a cellulose stick mode, which is for 6010 rods, and the TIG setting. All of the settings I've talked about are saved separately for each mode. So if you have your hot start, arc force, and arc breaking voltage set one way for 6010, you can have it set a completely different way in standard stick mode and easily switch back and forth without having to change the settings every time. There is also an auto power down timer that can be adjusted or simply turned off. The ESAB Rogue does have far fewer advanced settings. It has only a basic arc force and hot start setting. The one thing the Fronius lacks that the Rogue has is the remote amperage control port. I have the basic stick version of the Transpocket 180, so it's a little bit more stick welding focused, but there is a TIG version that has remote amperage control and a built-in gas solenoid, but it is quite a bit more expensive. In terms of output, the Transpocket 180 has a max stick welding current of 120 amps when running on 120 volts, which is very good as long as it doesn't pull so much current that it trips a breaker. I will be testing the current draw too. It also has an incredible max output of 170 amps with a 40% duty cycle when in TIG mode on 120 volts. TIG mode uses a lower arc voltage, which means the total output wattage is lower than when in running stick mode. That's why many welders support a higher current in TIG mode, particularly when running on 120 volts. But 170 amp output from 120 volt is still huge. Again, I'll be testing the input current to see how viable that output is on a standard 20 amp circuit. As the name 180 suggests, max output on 240 volts is 180 amps in stick mode, but it is actually 220 amps in TIG mode. Duty cycle is very good. It's not rated as high as the Amicos I've tested recently, but considering the attention to detail in other areas, I'm much more confident that the duty cycle of this machine was tested and validated to ensure proper operation and long component life. As it is, the Transpocket 180 does have a higher duty cycle and a bit higher output in some situations than the ESAB Rogue. I'm also curious how the internal build of this welder compares to something like the ESAB. So let's take a quick look at that. I've opened up the case on both welders. Obviously the Transpocket 180 is on the left and the ESAB Rogue is on the right. The Rogue has a bit of an eccentric design. There are lots of individual boards all over the place, and they're all interconnected in various ways with wires just running everywhere. It's possible that this allows them to source off-the-shelf parts for a lot of things, which might help reduce cost. It is kind of cool to see that it's not the same cookie cutter design that I've seen in almost every stick welder I've reviewed. In fact, even the ESAB 161 LTS uses that same internal design, though I can't say if that was an original design that was copied or what. I'm not saying that that common design is a problem, it just seems to be the same setup that every inexpensive stick welder is built on these days. The Rogue is a completely different design, and it's just cool to see something different. It seems like good efforts were made to mitigate issues from vibration, and they certainly weren't shy with the Solastic, which is slathered all over the place. There are boards and bare conductors fairly close to the outer metal case on both sides, but there are these plastic sheets in place to provide electrical insulation. It's an extremely busy design, but there are some nice touches. The Fronius is a polar opposite inside. It has a far cleaner, more elegant setup. It uses only a few, much larger boards with much less need to interconnect them a million different ways. All the boards and components are coated with a thin layer of epoxy or some kind of enamel, which means that all the components are held firmly to the board and to each other. No components are loose or free to vibrate. The heatsink on the Fronius is encased in a duct for cooling air, and on this side, the duct has a channel that directs some of the airflow up to the capacitors and transformer. The boards and components on both sides are set well back from the outer metal case, so there's no danger of shorting or arcing to the case. It definitely gives the impression of a much higher end, more refined design. I don't know how much we really learned from that, but for me, it's always fun to take a look inside. I'm going to get these both back together, and then I'll finally do some welding with the Fronius and see how it performs. Arc starts are almost effortless, and they actually felt slightly different than most other welders. I'd line up to scratch the rod, and the arc would just start. It took me by surprise the first couple of times, but it's nice once you get used to it. Don't get me wrong, it's not high frequency start or anything, but it just started so easy. When the amperage is dialed in with the 7018 rod, it runs so smooth it reminded me of running dual shield flux core in a MIG welder. 6010 did run great. And remember the arc break voltage I mentioned, that setting? I did turn that setting from 40 to 55 on the 6010 mode because I had the arc turn off once or twice when long arcing 6010. It only happened when I was probably running a bit too high in amperage and the rod was burning really quick. I don't normally really run 6010, so I'm not very good with it either. But once I turned that setting up to 55, it never happened again. I did use the pulse setting on some 1/16 inch thick metal. It worked fine, and it did seem to help limit the heat. 16th inch thick material is a bit tricky regardless, and I was using 1/16 inch electrodes, which also tend to be tricky as well because they just bounce around so much. But I was able to run a 1/16 inch butt weld with nothing backing it to pull out heat. If I welded all the way across the piece in one go, it would start to burn through towards the end, but otherwise I was able to weld 16th inch material with no burn through. If this had been an important part and not just something I was messing around with, I'd start at one end and weld to the middle, then I would stop, start at the other end, and weld to the middle from the other direction. This would allow the part to cool a bit between welds, but also the edge is where you're most likely to burn through, so if you start there, it allows you to move away from the edge as heat builds up rather than moving towards the edge as heat builds up. But even still, for a stick welder, it's not too bad to weld even down to 1/16 inch metal. The fan is fairly low pitched and not bothersome. It also only runs when needed, and at 120 amps and below, I could make short welds without the fan even coming on. Once it does turn on, it turns off pretty quick once you stop welding. This is also a very efficient welder. Even maxed out on 120 volts, it shouldn't have any problem running on a 20 amp circuit. It shouldn't have any problem with tripping a breaker. And when maxed out on 240 volts, it still only pulls around 20 amps, a little bit over 20 amps. So this is a very efficient machine, and it should run great on just, common circuits. I didn't try TIG welding with it yet, but I'll probably make another video with both this welder and the ESAB Rogue 180i, where I do some TIG welding with both of them. But as a stick welder, this is an awesome machine. The pulse and advanced configuration options make it very versatile. It runs really smooth, it comes with excellent quality accessories, and it's just really nice to use in pretty much every way. In other words, I absolutely recommend this machine. It is really high quality and it performs awesome. But I understand it's not exactly a budget machine. Realistically, the ESAB Rogue is half the price and it's probably a better value for most people. But the Fronius is a bit nicer machine, and it may be worth the money for someone who appreciates the quality and attention to detail. So that's it for now. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll answer if I can. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.